Sharing today on this topic, gut health and food sensitivities. So let's get started talking about things. Okay, before we get started, actually, I just want to share a little bit about naturopathic medicine in case you're not familiar with it, because I'm a naturopathic doctor. So naturopathic medicine is very, very individualized. We like to say the example of 10 people with the same medical diagnosis would get 10 different treatment plans from a naturopathic doctor. So it's very individualized to each person, which comes into play when we're talking about gut health and food sensitivities especially. With naturopathic medicine, we want to identify and address the root causes of whatever the health concern is so that we can help to facilitate healing at a deeper level rather than just symptom suppression. And while we do want to alleviate symptoms, we really do want to help the body to heal. And for everyone who's just joining now, if you wouldn't mind just muting your microphone, that would be great, just to prevent feedback audio-wise. Okay, and then naturopathic medicine is also works to support the body to help regulate itself so that you're not relying on external substances any more than is necessary. We also work to provide efficient care, meaning simple, less invasive, as kind of seamlessly as we can do things, the better. And then naturopathic medicine is very integrative. It's not naturopathic and nothing else. Most of my patients see other doctors as well, and most of my patients have another primary care provider. So it's very integrative. So all of this is just kind of a nice background if you're not familiar with naturopathic medicine before we get into the talk, because all of this plays a role, especially with gut health. Okay. If anyone has questions about naturopathic medicine, I'd be happy to answer them as well. All right, and I just have to figure out how I move my slides here. Just bear with me for one moment. Okay, clicking, that's it. All right, so before I start going into all the information, I just have to mention that this presentation today, it's for informational purposes and educational purposes only. It's not medical advice. Always check with your own doctor or healthcare provider before making any big changes. All right, so digestive health. All disease begins in the gut. This is something that is attributed to Hippocrates, who's known as the father of modern medicine, and he was kind of generalizing here. We know that all disease doesn't begin in the gut necessarily, but we do know that gut health plays a significant role in the health of the rest of your body and can play a big role in disease processes and how the disease process happens in the body, as well as the healing response. So digestive health and your digestive tract, gut concerns, all of these things impact your whole body health. I've listed just some kind of general things that can be impacted when your gut health is impacted. So GI issues, of course, things like constipation, diarrhea, other bowel movement issues, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or IBD, irritable bowel disease, which is more severe, like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And then other issues like malnutrition, autoimmune conditions. There's so many different autoimmune conditions that we know about today. Allergies, joint pain, headaches, all of these things are affected by digestive health. It can affect your immune function, depression, anxiety, other mental, emotional aspects, reproductive health, fertility, endocrine function, which includes things like your thyroid, bone density, other aging issues, sinus issues, skin conditions, psoriasis, rashes, all that kind of stuff. So digestive health really does play a role in your whole body health. It's not just kind of isolated in your digestive system. We'll talk more about that. Your digestive system is in many ways like a gateway to the rest of your body, because it's where everything that you take in, all of your food, your drink, whatever else you're taking, like supplements, medications, it's where everything is absorbed. So that means that the ability of your GI tract to function well is really important. So let's just talk a little bit more specifically about what your digestive tract includes. So we start up with your mouth, and you can see in the picture, it's kind of a nice visual. If you travel through the mouth, then we have the esophagus, kind of the throat, the esophagus, and then we get into the stomach. And then from the stomach, we go into the small intestine, which is that purplish mass of tubing there. We also have the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas that are kind of tucked near where the small intestine and stomach are. And then the small intestine, remember that was from the stomach, that then connects to the large intestine, and then that goes out your rectum and your anus, and that's out the other side. So your digestive system includes all of these different organs. And your digestive system is actually like a closed tube in a sense. So it can be considered external to the body, which is really interesting when you're thinking about it because it's inside the body, but it can, in a sense, be thought of as external. And part of that is also because the lining of your digestive tract comes into contact with a lot of things that you take in from the external environment, so it has to be able to handle them. So barring any other digestive issues that could create holes or leakage in this digestive tract, it's a closed tube. Just an interesting thing to think about. So how digestion happens, it really starts before you even eat anything. The anticipation of food itself triggers your digestive system to start getting ready for food and to start getting ready for production. So saliva, stomach acid, and enzymes are all produced to help you with digesting your food. And these can be triggered by the aroma of food or by just thinking about eating. And there's like a classic example of a dog with drool hanging out of its mouth when it sees a piece of meat. So that's just an example of the dog's thinking about meat. It sees the meat, it might smell the meat, and it's starting to salivate because its digestive system is saying, hey, there's meat, we need to get ready because we're going to eat it. And then your food, once you put it in your mouth, it starts to get broken down into smaller pieces. The first step is chewing and your saliva. So when you chew, you really do break down a piece of food into smaller and smaller pieces. And that's a big step there because that really reduces the work that the rest of your digestive system has to do. The more you can chew, the better. And there's this term, Fletcherize. If no one's heard of Fletcherize before, don't feel bad. I didn't know this word until naturopathic med school. But Fletcherize basically means chewing. So you want to make sure to chew your food a lot. And Fletcherize is kind of a funny sounding word, so it could be memorable in a way. So if that helps you, just think of Fletcherizing your food at mealtime. So you're chewing a lot, and then your saliva also contains enzymes that help to start breaking down your food in your mouth. Then you swallow your food and it's in your stomach, and that's where your stomach acid starts to digest your food further. And that can be especially helpful when you are eating things that may be a little bit harder for some of those enzymes to get to. And then you also have digestive enzymes that are produced in large part by your pancreas. So those also help. After your food is digested by all of those different things, it's in very small pieces that are then ready to be absorbed into your body. So, for example, things like glucose or fructose, amino acids, these really tiny little bits of food. The food is broken down into its smaller and smaller forms until it's ready to be absorbed. And then the food in these tiny little pieces is absorbed through your small intestine. The lining of your small intestine contains cells that work to get these little tiny pieces of food, these nutrients, into your body. And your small intestine itself is actually about 20 to 25 feet long, all wrapped up inside of you. It's about an inch or so in diameter also, for those of you who are visual. I like to know that kind of stuff. So it's about 20 to 25 feet long and about an inch in diameter. And then the lining of your small intestine is actually about 2,500 to 3,000 square feet, which is huge. That's like the size of a good-sized house, right? That's huge. 3,000 square feet, that's really big. And we'll talk about why it's that big in a moment. But it's just amazing that all of that fits right inside you. It's right inside you now, 2,500 to 3,000 square feet of digesting surface space. Or absorbing surface space, I should say. So that huge surface area is really where your food is absorbed. And all along your small intestine, that lining again, all along that are these little projections. They look kind of like little fingers that wave around, and they're called villi. This is where your food is really absorbed. And so here's a visual of the villi, and this is also sometimes called the brush border because you can see it kind of looks like a brush in a way. And this is a nice visual because it shows the tubular shape of the small intestine and then all the little villi around it. So this is how the surface space of your small intestine is really so large, because it has all of these villi that are waving around, ready to absorb your food. So the villi, those finger-like little projections there, that's where the cells in your small intestine that absorb your food are located. So each villi, each of those little projections, and I have a picture of this in a moment, but each of those little projections has many different cells on it that absorb your food. They're called enterocytes. And then you also have something called microvilli, which are these little hair-like structures that are on the surface of the villi that work to further increase the surface space of the villi and also to kind of pull food into the cells. So here's the villi picture again on the left, and then on the right you can see the kind of the more zoomed in version. So you can see in the middle the villi sticking up, and they have all these little tiny squares or rectangles along the edges. So those are all over the whole surface area of each villi. Those are all the little enterocytes. And then the zoomed in picture over here shows the microvilli. They look like little kind of wavy hairs on the top of the cells there. Okay. So those cells, those enterocytes, are packed very closely together, and that makes up your gut lining, if you've heard of that term, your gut lining. And then below the cells are the blood vessels that help to provide nutrients to the cells, because they are, cells in your body, they need nutrients, things like oxygen and other things that help them carry out their cellular processes, in addition to absorbing the food that's coming into your body. So the blood vessels provide those nutrients, and they also help to carry the food that's absorbed to the rest of your body. So just looking at this picture again, you can see the blood vessels here that are below the villi, and then they actually go up into the villi to carry all the nutrients to them and from them. And they also, of course, would carry waste products from the cells as well. So your enterocytes, again, these are the cells in your villi that absorb the food. It's very important for them to be packed closely together to provide like a very tight seal for your gut lining. They have what are called tight junctions between them, and you can think of them as watertight. So nothing should be passing through at all. There should be nothing going through the space in between those cells. They're held together by different things, including proteins like claudins, occludins, and zonulin, which we can actually measure in lab work. Sometimes we'll look at that to see what extent is someone's gut integrity compromised. So we can actually measure that, but these tight junctions are very important between the cells. When the tight junctions are no longer watertight, if something happens and they're no longer watertight, it can allow particles to pass between the cells and enter the body without first going into the cells and going through all of the appropriate regulatory and processing steps. And this is where the term leaky gut comes from, because it's like the cells, the area between them is not tight anymore, so things are leaking through it. So when food is allowed to sneak into the body this way, again, those tight junctions are looser, it can lead to problems, and food sensitivities can come out of this, and they can also worsen with this, and this can contribute to other sorts of concerns as well. So here's another picture where you can see, on the left we have the cells together, and they're all kind of tightly fit together, and then towards the right there's spaces between them where things can get into the body and in a way that they're not supposed to. So what happens to cause the tight junctions to become looser? Inflammation. It's a general term, but this is generally what's happening. Inflammation is a really important part of your body's immune response. It's not a bad thing, even though we think of it that way often. It becomes not so great when it becomes out of hand, when it goes unchecked. And that is what has become so common today, especially in things like leaky gut, if we call it that, or other types of inflammatory conditions. So the inflammation in your gut, when it happens, it can lead to loosening up the tight junctions that are between the cells, and it can cause the cells to swell. They can become inflamed. There are other inflammatory kind of byproducts and modulators, and there's a whole immune response that happens when inflammation is present, and all of that contributes to the cells just kind of becoming a little bit looser, so that loosening up, things can then go between them and get into the body. Inflammation in your gut also does increase the burden on your body, because it's something else that your body has to deal with. So your immune system, which is where the inflammation comes from, your immune system is really remarkable. It's trained to recognize invaders, so things like bacteria, viruses, things that we don't necessarily want to be in the body, or we want to regulate them in the body. And then when your immune system recognizes them, it can launch an attack on them. So it's a protective mechanism. And your immune system also remembers what the invaders, what the pathogens look like, so that it can protect you in the future. So to be able to remember these invaders, your immune system has a whole process around it, and it produces something called antibodies. Antibodies are basically little pieces of protein that signal that a certain pathogen is in your body, and it tells your immune system, this bad thing is here, so now we need to prepare for attack and start attacking. There are many different types of antibodies. And here we're going to talk about immunoglobulins, which are abbreviated Ig, immunoglobulins. And there are different types of immunoglobulins. I've listed just a few here. The IgE type is what is associated with an allergy, so with more of an emergency type situation, like your throat closes, you have trouble breathing, that kind of thing. The IgE, you could think of it as E for emergency if you wanted to try to remember it. So IgE for emergency, that's an outright allergy. An IgG, immunoglobulin G response, is more of a chronic response. And this is what we're going to focus on a little bit more here. And then an IgA response, immunoglobulin A, is related to secretory and mucous membranes. And we also sometimes look at this with gut pathologies, depending on the person. But primarily, we're looking at the IgG. So the immunoglobulin G, again, this is the primary one that we look at with food sensitivities. And it tells us that your body has flagged a food as an invader that needs to be attacked. So it tells us that your body is mounting some sort of immune reaction to the food that's triggering it. And so when food sensitivities develop, they can often develop related to different sorts of issues happening in the gut. So those looser tight junctions between your gut cells, between those enterocytes, causing like that leaky gut kind of picture, that can allow food bits to kind of get into your body and cause this immune response. Other disease processes can happen that can also allow little food particles or other things to get into your body. For example, if you have like an ulceration in another part of your digestive tract, that could allow things to get in. And then cross-reactivities with other foods and environmental factors, like seasonal allergies, for example, that can sometimes compound food sensitivity issues. We'll talk about that shortly too. So immunoglobulin G, this is, again, the primary antibody that we look at for food sensitivities. And this tells us that your body has flagged a food as an invader. So we know that when you eat a certain food, your immune system is going to see that food and it's going to say, hey, this food that we don't like, it's an invader, it's here, so now we need to step up our response to it. So your immune system will then produce more antibodies and your IgG antibody level is going to rise. Now, the antibodies themselves are not attacking anything. Rather, they're triggering an immune response in your body and the rest of your immune system. It's like a cascade response. The rest of your immune system is kind of going down the line. And your immune system remembers the food with the IgG antibody. It has this memory as a protective measure. It can take months for your body to forget about the food, to forget that it has this IgG antibody to it. So an IgG response to a food, again, it leads to more of an immune response, but it's not an emergency type of response like, or an emergency type of situation like with an IgE response, where someone could go into like an anaphylactic state. The IgG response is more of a chronic inflammatory response in the gut. And especially if you think about those visuals again of those enterocytes, those cells with the tight junctions and the villi, inflammation all around that. And often people won't know that they have this happening. It's not something you'd necessarily notice. It's more like a simmering a simmering inflammation that's happening. And simmering is a nice way to look at it because it's not outright like boiling over the top, causing a ton of symptoms that you might seek treatment for necessarily, but it's more of just a simmering. There's something definitely happening, but it's not a more urgent situation. But it can certainly impact your digestion because this is happening in your digestive tract. And it can also impact your bowel movements. It can cause changes with gas and bloating. It can disrupt your microbiome. It can certainly affect the absorption of your nutrients if this is happening widespread in your gut. And in many ways related to that, it can contribute to other sorts of health concerns. So chronic inflammation in your digestive tract can contribute to other health concerns. And this list is an echo of the list that I had at the beginning of the presentation, just showing kind of the wide variety of things that can be affected by food sensitivities and this chronic inflammation happening in the gut. So again, all sorts of gut issues, from more functional things, constipation, diarrhea, to more severe conditions like IBD or Crohn's or colitis, and then malnutrition, autoimmune conditions, allergies, joint pain, headaches, skin conditions, psoriasis, rashes, and it certainly can impact the immune system, especially if your intake of nutrients is compromised, depression, anxiety, other mental, emotional changes, and bone density, sinus issues, all sorts of stuff. So just the takeaway from this is really that inflammation in your gut doesn't just stay in your gut, it affects the rest of your body in different ways. And this actually just kind of echoes that prior slide. It's not just the gut that's inflamed. Again, inflammation in the gut can play a role in other things that are happening. And of course, with naturopathic medicine, we look at the whole person. So it's not just food sensitivities. We're looking at the whole person to see what's happening and what else could be contributing, because this is not the only thing that could be a factor for most people. Okay, so chronic inflammation in the gut, it does increase the allergenic load, the load of allergens or sensitivities that your body has to deal with. It also increases the immune burden, and it kind of takes immune energy away from other stuff, which can weaken your immune function, and it can just make it more challenging if you do get sick with something, because your body may not have the kind of the fuller immune capacity that it would have if it wasn't dealing with this chronic simmering inflammation going on. This chronic inflammation in the gut can also, of course, impact your gut function, nutrient absorption, like I mentioned, and it can contribute to cross-reactivity with other substances. We're still going to talk more about that cross-reactivity. That's coming still. So what do we do about food sensitivities, though? We want to really identify and address the triggers so that we can figure out what's happening and then deal with it. So we want to overall reduce the chronic simmering inflammation that's happening. And we do that by resetting the immune response. That's the goal. We want to reset the immune response. And resetting the immune response, again, your immune system remembers through those IgG antibodies, it remembers the foods that you have these sensitivities to. So when we reset your immune response, we are helping your body to kind of forget about those IgG antibodies. So one way of addressing food sensitivities is to do an elimination diet to identify what are your food sensitivities. This is something that, depending on the person, we might eliminate different varieties or different categories of foods, but you would do it for 4 to 6 or more weeks. Longer is better. And this is usually, it's individualized. There are a lot of foods that you can take out if you really want to do like a whole very strict elimination diet. The elimination diet is kind of like the gold standard for food sensitivity testing. However, it can be extremely hard for someone to adhere to because of how strict it has to be, down to like the crumb. It's not just kind of a casual thing. It's very, very strict, and it is often a lot of foods. So another option, and often a more practical option for people, is to do a blood test to see your reactivity to foods. And this is where we can actually measure that IgG antibody response to the different foods. We can measure other immunoglobulins this way as well. So the blood test for these foods is done through either a blood draw or through a finger prick test. This kind of testing is available through basic labs, and by that I mean just labs you'd go to for routine blood work, and also through more specialty labs. The specialty labs tend to have more comprehensive testing that tends to be lower cost overall for people usually. And it's also more accurate usually. The specialty labs, or at least the one that I like to use, does double verification checks of all of their food sensitivity testing, so that when you send a sample in, you know it's not just being tested one time, it's being tested twice to verify that someone's having a reactivity. That's not done if you go to like just kind of a routine lab to do things. And with this kind of testing, it's nice to have that extra kind of peace of mind around that, because you are making some dietary and potentially lifestyle shifts with this. So the IgG food sensitivity testing can really be helpful. We can test for a wide range of foods, and we can test for very specific foods. And sometimes we'll see foods that seem to be healthy, like spinach or pumpkin, things that we think are healthy when we're eating them, but we can have a sensitivity to them, and we may be having an immune reaction to something like that, and we may never know unless we do a little bit more digging. The IgG food sensitivity testing that I typically do with my patients, when it's indicated, it tests for about 100 different foods. There are larger panels that we can use if we want to, and we can also customize the testing for different cultural or dietary needs. For example, if somebody is vegetarian, or if somebody eats primarily an Asian cuisine, we can customize the panels that way too. And the IgG food sensitivity testing should really measure the reactivity to the food, not just say like yes or no, but it should measure the reactivity. And it should measure it in a quantitative way so that you actually get like a number of how high your reactivity is. And they usually will provide a graded scale. The lab that I use for this does. Most labs, I think, do. And this is an example of just of a test report. And so you can see there's some different food categories listed here. And this is very visual, which is nice for a lot of people because it kind of gives you this visual scale. Green is good, red is bad in a sense, but it's more nuanced than that. And we look at this in the context of the whole report and also in the context of someone's health individually. And we can see kind of how reactive they are to things. This particular person has a lot more reactivity than I usually see on these types of tests, but this is just an example. Okay, So what do we do then once we get the results? Well, once we get all this information and we see that someone is sensitive to like gliadin and gluten and green beans, what do we do with this information? Remember, the goal is to reset the immune response to the food. So we want your body, your immune system really, to stop seeing the food as an invader and to stop producing antibodies against it. We want your immune system to kind of forget about the food. So to reset this immune response, what we'll often do is remove those really reactive foods or the trigger foods from your diet for a certain amount of time, 3 months, 6 months, more, depending on what's practical for somebody, but also, how severe are the issues that we're working with. And then we really want to allow time for the immune system, again, to forget about the food so that it stops producing these antibodies. I would say usually 6 months is kind of the minimum for this. This can be really, really challenging for some people. So sometimes we'll just do 3 months and then we'll see where they're at and we'll see if we can go a little bit further. And then once we reach that time point, we would reintroduce the food in a very specific way to assess how the body is responding to the food. And we wouldn't, for example, we wouldn't reintroduce all of the foods at once. We would do it in a specific way and timed out a specific way so that we can really assess, has the body forgotten about its response to the food, which is the goal. You would also do this kind of thing for an elimination diet. You would eliminate those foods for a period of time, and then after that period of time, you would start to slowly reintroduce them to assess the response of the body to see if the body has forgotten that it thought they were bad. Some other things to consider here are healing the gut is really, this is customized for everybody, but when we're taking out these food sensitivity triggers, if someone has had food sensitivities going on for a while, they have some gut inflammation happening. So healing the gut, soothing the gut, calming things down and helping those little cells, the enterocytes, helping them to get a little bit healthier can be nice. So for this, we can use things like botanical medicine, which are different plant types of medicine. We can also use micronutrients, things like amino acids or vitamins, minerals. And then the mind-body connection is big here. Stress certainly impacts the digestive system and also the healing response. And then taking into account other types of gut issues that might be going on and the person as a whole. So this kind of thing is really customized to each person, but it can be helpful depending on what's going on to help the gut to heal during the time of elimination too. And then something else to consider is supporting the gut microbiome. This is also individualized, but when you have that kind of simmering inflammatory response that comes with food sensitivities over a longer time, it's going to affect your microbiome. So it can be helpful to support your microbiome during that time of elimination. And supporting the microbiome can involve things like prebiotics and probiotics. Prebiotics are like the food that the probiotics eat. It's a way to think of them. And then different food influences on the microbiome. So thinking about other dietary factors along with the food avoidances that you're doing. And then the mind-body connection, because just like stress impacts the digestive function, it also impacts your microbiome. And the microbiome, just to be clear on that, it's the bacteria that live in your gut, and it should really be in a healthy balance. And then another thing to consider is cross-reactivity. So this is where if you have a sensitivity to a certain food or to something in the environment, you can actually be more reactive to other things because of that. And one theory around this is that if the molecules of one substance look similar enough to those of another substance, they can trigger an immune reaction. And this can also kind of trigger a more compound or a more severe reaction. So this is common, or when it does happen for people, it's common to happen with seasonal allergies. So for example, birch trees are known to sometimes cross-react with hazelnuts. This doesn't happen for everyone, but it can happen. So if somebody enjoys hazelnuts usually and they don't have any issues, but then during allergy season, they notice that their allergies are worse when they eat the hazelnuts, it's likely because of this cross-reactivity where the hazelnuts are kind of driving up the sensitive or allergic response to the seasonal allergies. And then it can also affect gut inflammation too. And it can affect other symptoms, things that we're not necessarily thinking about, but things like joint pain or headaches, other sorts of things that some people do experience with seasonal allergies. Another example of this is ragweed. I tried to pick a common example. So ragweed is a pretty common allergy for seasonal allergies. Ragweed can cross-react with this whole list of foods here. This doesn't mean that this happens for everyone, and you may have an allergy to ragweed but have no reactivity with anything else listed here. But these are just potential things that ragweed can cross-react with. So something that you could do if you just wanted to see is to pay attention to when your ragweed allergy is acting up. How do you feel after you eat any of these foods, or just how do you feel after you eat different foods in general during allergy season? And you may be able to pinpoint different cross-reactivity reactions if that's coming up for you. And then something else to consider in the context of gut health and talking about food eliminations, especially, or even if it's for a limited time, is just making sure that we're individualizing talking about food, because eating and food can be a sensitive topic for many people for different reasons. So it's really important, especially during a patient visit, to keep this in mind when we're talking about taking foods out of the diet and avoiding foods, and to also be culturally sensitive to this. So we always want to individualize all of this. And so all of these different considerations here that we talked about, as well as just overall health, chronic diseases, other health conditions, and then any practical considerations, because that does come up for some people where, you know, the rest of their family eats a certain way and they're not able to eliminate certain foods, or, you know, whatever is going on for someone, we do want to make it doable. So it's important to work with someone where they're at to reduce the food triggers and hopefully work towards resetting that immune function. So all of this said, this is just a great example of why it's so important to individualize healthcare, because there's no one size fits all. Everyone is served better when medicine and healthcare is individualized. And that's certainly what we do as naturopathic physicians. So I'd like to just kind of wrap up the talk on this note that your digestive system is really, really amazing in what it does every day. With all that we've been talking about, all the different things that can factor into your gut health, remember, your digestive system is really amazing. It does a lot of really cool, brilliant stuff. And the goal is really to just support its optimal functioning, because that's going to support the rest of your body's health, and everything is connected. So we talked about, just a little recap here, we talked about your gut function, food sensitivities, and then identifying and addressing those sensitivities and other things to consider when we're working on gut health. And a reminder, this is all for educational purposes only, not medical advice. And I would be happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions. Thank you all for being here so that I can share this information. I love doing these talks. And thank you, Eric, and the library as well. And I have my website here if anyone wants additional info. And I'll just mention this now in case anyone is getting off of the webinar now. But if you did enjoy this talk and you'd like to stay in the loop and get other health wellness information, I've got a lot of free resources and information on my website, including a monthly newsletter. So check it out. Everything's on my website. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I was going to say too, if you want to, privately chat them for whatever reason, since gut sensitivity may be a sensitive topic, you can go ahead and chat them privately as well. But we did actually have one question in the chat, and that is, how are the liver and gallbladder involved in digestion?
Yeah. So let's see if I can go back to that slide real quick for a visual. So the liver and the gallbladder are in what's called the Hepatobiliary Tree. I like having a visual here. So the liver and the gallbladder here, the gallbladder is where your bile is stored. And so this can be an issue for some people if they have trouble taking in fats and digesting fats. Their gallbladder may sometimes need to be removed, actually. And the liver helps to detoxify things that, so both the liver and the gallbladder feed into the duodenal part of the small intestine, right at the top here. And then the pancreas is also right around that area and is providing enzymes. So these guys are all really important. The liver and the gallbladder are not where they're not where any food passes through, but rather they act as kind of processing and like storage for your food. And then the bile from the gallbladder is actually also, it's stored in the gallbladder, but it's also released back into the small intestine, and it kind of mixes with the food as it's being digested in there too. And your body excretes it through the rest of your digestive tract. So the liver and the gallbladder are not, they're not part of that closed tube, but they do play a very, very important role in how your digestive function works. And then they also, the liver also has other functions. And the pancreas is in there too, and that's very, very important as well with producing digestive enzymes. And then it's also related in things like blood sugar regulation. So yeah, good question.
We do have a couple more. I'll just give them both to you so you can kind of decide which one you want to focus on more. The first one is, if your nose runs immediately after eating a food, does that signify a probable allergy? And then the second question is, can you talk a little more about the impact on bone density?
Sure. So if your nose runs right after eating a food, so that does signal that something is happening, some sort of immune response. So it could potentially be a food sensitivity. It could also potentially be one of those cross reactivities where the food is triggering or it's compounding and then triggering the runny nose response, especially if it's happening during like an allergy season. Another thing to think about is there are other allergens in the air that are not necessarily seasonal allergens. Like if you live somewhere where you might be exposed to mold, or you work somewhere where you might be exposed to mold, that's another pretty common allergen that can have some cross reactivities. And also dust, animal hair, dander, all different things that aren't necessarily allergy season allergies can play a role in that cross reactivity. So it could be a food sensitivity, but it could also be kind of a compounded effect. But it's something that, especially if you're noticing that it's happening timing wise right after you eat a certain food, that food is somehow kind of implicated in that. So it might be something to explore a little bit more with your own healthcare provider, if that would make sense. I hope that answers that question. If you have any other question on that, just type it in the chat. And then the bone density. What was the exact question with the bone density?
They'd asked a little more about the impact on bone density. I would assume that like gut health.
Yeah. So the impact on bone density with gut health. So this is an example of a more indirect connection. But if you think about it, when you're eating all of these different foods, you may be taking supplements and medications to support your bone health. All of that stuff has to be absorbed by your digestive tract in order for your body to be able to use it, to take it in and use it. And that includes in order for your bones to be able to use it. So if your gut health is compromised, especially if you're not able to absorb your nutrients appropriately, then that's going to cut down on the amount of nutrients that you're absorbing, right? Or the amount of the bone supplement or the medication. It can cut down on the amount that's absorbed by the body. And when you have less resources going in, there's then less resources to give to the body. So less minerals, nutrients, things going to the bones to support bone density. So that's kind of the relationship there. I hope that's helpful. If you have more questions with that, just let us know. And the liver also, just since I mentioned the liver also does help with kind of the processing and the packaging and the excretion of different like things like supplements and medications to different extents that you take.
Another one here, somebody asks, how often would you recommend taking a food sensitivity test? I took one in 2012 and followed it with an elimination diet. I'm still not eating those foods to avoid after all these years. I never did a follow-up test and I'm wondering if it would be beneficial to do so. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So a couple of thoughts on that. One is that from 2012, so 8 years ago, so things can certainly change in the body from then to now. So if you wanted to do a food sensitivity test again, it may well indicate very different things than your test back in 2012, or it could indicate some of the similar things that you had there. But it really depends on the person. I usually actually don't retest again for food sensitivities unless someone wants to. And part of that is also because the testing that I do through a specialty lab is not covered by insurance. It's not expensive in the range of test costing, but it's not covered by insurance. So it's just an out-of-pocket cost that we can keep down by not repeating the testing. But the more important thing is that it's not really necessary to repeat that testing unless someone really wants to see the quantitative measurement. But because of what we do with the results, we look at the results and then we take the foods out of someone's diet for a period of time to reset that immune response, and then we reintroduce the foods. Because we're reintroducing the foods in a very specific way, we should, through that, be able to assess how the body is handling the food. And we should be able to see, is this food okay for someone, or are they still having some sort of response to it? And that would give us the information that we really need, kind of in a sense, kind of like what you would do with an elimination diet at that time point. You would reintroduce the foods. You're not doing any testing. So I don't typically retest somebody unless they really want to see the quantitative results. And different doctors may have different opinions on that, but that's kind of my approach to it. But I do think that, if we go many years between tests, things can shift in the body. So it could be worth doing another one, not to check you, like kind of not as a checkpoint for the prior one, but more just to see what sensitivities you might have at this point in your life. Good question.
A couple more. The first one is, if you don't think you have a sensitivity, would you recommend it anyway? I assume that means recommend testing anyway.
Yeah. So that's a good question. If you don't think you have a sensitivity, I tend to not recommend things unless we have a reason to do them. So I probably wouldn't unless someone, and I do get people who come in and are very interested in their food sensitivities, then we would do it. But depending on really what someone's priorities are, would determine that. And it can be helpful information to have, but as with any information, once you get the information, what are you going to do with it? So it would also depend, when you get the information, will you want to Will you want to start working on resetting your immune response to whatever comes up, even though you may not have any symptoms or other things going on to necessarily motivate you that way? So it's a really individualized kind of question, I think, but I hope that helps.
And then one more here. If you experience numerous years of food sensitivities, can this cause issues with the pancreas and its capability of enzyme production?
That's a good question. So directly it shouldn't. However, because of just the general, like the inflammatory response and the proximity of your small intestine to your pancreas and really to everything in your abdomen, potentially your pancreas could be affected if you have a lot of food sensitivity issues, a lot of that simmering kind of inflammation happening. Potentially your pancreas could be affected. There would probably or potentially be other things going on with your digestion that would impact your pancreatic function more. But I think the proximity of the pancreas to your small intestine, if there's an immune response happening in the small intestine, it could potentially kind of spill over and potentially affect the pancreas. And then, depending on the extent of the inflammation happening, it can be pulling resources away from other systems in the body. And so potentially the pancreas could be affected that way. But the enzymes themselves, I don't think those would be like downregulated by just the presence of the inflammatory response in the gut further down.
And I think maybe these next two will probably be our last two, although maybe there will be time for one more. But somebody asked, and you may not know this offhand, but what percentage of people are living with food sensitivity and don't realize it?
So that's a great question. And so I think that's a hard question to answer because well, two things. One, we don't necessarily know the exact percentage of people who have food sensitivities who have been tested. I recently read something that said about 5% of people have food sensitivities. I would tend to think that number is actually much higher than that, but maybe to a more severe extent might be 5%, but I would tend to think the number is much higher than that. But living with food sensitivities and don't know it, because if they don't know it, then there's no other way to track it. So that would probably be really hard to know, and I'm not quite sure even how to guess at that. But I think there is a potential for anybody to develop food sensitivities. So it could be a very large percentage of people. But just again, to keep in mind that the digestive system and the body, it's all really amazing, and everything works well, and it functions every day to do what it needs to do. So people don't usually kind of seek support for things like food sensitivities unless something is happening that's causing them more of a severe issue, or if they're just really curious. But knowing how it impacts the rest of the body too, it could be useful to check more people.
And then another is, I might have missed this, but what causes the leaky gut, the spaces between the villi and enterocytes?
Yeah, so let me see if I can go down a few slides. So it's really inflammation is kind of the big culprit there. So inflammation. So when, and I like having the visuals here, but when you have the inflammation happening, inflammation, it's a general term, but when you have inflammation happening, there's like swelling is happening. There's redness. There's which means more blood is in the area. There's more of an immune response. There's an immune cascade of things that happen. But if you look at the visual here, when the cells are getting kind of swollen up and inflamed, the inflammation can also cause them to be to have less integrity. So they kind of lose a little bit of their integrity, and they can loosen up apart from each other. Those tight junctions can kind of come apart a little bit, and those proteins that are around the tight junctions, like the zonulin, the claudins, the occludins that were on another slide, those can start to actually be released too, because everything is kind of getting looser. So it's really inflammation that causes that loosening, and then allowing things to pass between them. So when that continues to happen, when that happens a little bit and then it kind of goes uncorrected and it continues to happen, it's hard for the cells in that area to heal without having a reprieve from the inflammation. So you've really got to get to the root cause of what's causing the inflammation, and it's an immune response. So what's causing the immune response? And that's where we go back to these IgG antibodies, and try to take out the foods that are the potential triggers.
Does anyone have any last question? We have a couple minutes left.
I'll just go back to this slide because it's a nice visual with the villi here, and pretty cool to think about.
Hi, this is Michelle. I thought I read somewhere on your newsletter that you're teaching a course. Is that true? And if so, what is it that you're teaching?
Yes, I would actually, I'd be happy to tell you a little bit more about that. I don't know that I should share that on this webinar, but I would be happy to tell you more about that if you wouldn't mind sending me an email.
Sure.
And my email is right on my website.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I guess we'll close with this last question. Is the main cause of inflammation food allergies?
Is the main cause of inflammation food allergies? Great question. No. So there are so many different causes of inflammation. I wouldn't say that the main cause is food allergies. Food allergies are one of the causes, but I wouldn't say they're the main cause. There's so many other potential causes of inflammation. For example, an inflammation, let me actually just see if I can find that slide as I'm talking. It's a really important part of your body's immune response, so it's not all bad. Inflammation is really important. If there was no inflammation, that wouldn't be good. It's just when the inflammation goes unchecked, when it's too much, that it becomes not so great, and that's what's become so common today and with the food sensitivities. So inflammation, there are so many different causes. For example, if you cut your finger, if you're chopping vegetables and cut your finger, you get a cut and it bleeds and then it heals. So that's an inflammatory response that has to happen for that healing to take place, for the healing of your skin to take place. So you need inflammation to happen. Just like getting a cut there, that's not caused by a food sensitivity. There's so many other factors, different disease processes, chronic conditions, autoimmune conditions, all sorts of factors that can trigger the inflammatory response. Both things that we don't want to happen necessarily, and also things that inflammation should happen with, like an immune healing response. Good question.
And that takes us right to 5 o'clock. So I wanted to thank you, Kathleen, for your presentation, also your thorough response to everybody's questions. And I wanted to thank all of you for logging on, and just to remind you that we do have a final kind of installment in this series. Kathleen will walk us through immunity, strengthening immunity in the colder months, I think you had titled it. So you can still register for that. It is on Veterans Day and the library is closed. That was an oversight on scheduling on my part, but we'll still be offering the